The old man's hands trembled as he set the chipped coffee mug down, its clink against the saucer slicing through the cafe's morning hum. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp with longing, fixed on the young waitress weaving between tables. "Miss," he whispered, voice barely louder than the rain tapping the window. "Could you pretend to be my daughter, just for a moment?" The cafe smelled of burnt toast and fresh rain, a small haven tucked in a forgotten corner of the city. Samuel Grayson, 82 years old, sat at his usual table by the window, where the light painted his wrinkles in soft gold. His coat, patched at the elbows, hung loosely on his frail frame, and his scarf knitted decades ago by hands he still dreamed off-draped over his shoulders like a memory. Every morning for 3 years, he'd come here, ordered black coffee, and watched the world pass by. But today was different. Today, the weight of solitude pressed harder, and the words slipped out before he could stop them. The waitress, Ellie, paused mid-stride, her tray wobbling. She was 23, with auburn hair tied in a messy bun and eyes that carried a quiet strength. She'd seen Samuel before, always alone, always polite, tipping generously despite his threadbare appearance. His request hung in the air, fragile and strange. "Your daughter?" she asked, her voice soft but curious, not mocking. Samuel's gaze dropped to the table, tracing the grain of the wood as if it held answers. "Just for a moment," he repeated, his voice cracking. "I had one long ago. She'd be about your age now." He didn't look up, afraid of the pity he might see. Instead, he heard the rustle of Ellie's apron as she slid into the chair across from him. The cafe faded the clatter of dishes, the murmur of patrons until it was just them. "Why me?" Ellie asked, leaning forward. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but searching, like she was trying to unravel a story she hadn't been told. Samuel's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You move like she did. Quick, but careful. And your laugh, I heard it yesterday when you spilled that tray of sugar packets." "It's hers." His fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth grounding him. Her name was Clara. Ellie didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to this. Customers usually asked for refills, not memories. But something in Samuel's eyes, the way they seemed to hold a lifetime of grief and love, made her stay. "Okay," she said softly. "What was Clara like?" Samuel exhaled, a shaky breath that carried years of unspoken words. "She was fire and light. Loved books, always had one in her hand. She'd read to me at night, her voice so clear it could chase away nightmares." He paused, his throat tight. "She was 16 when I lost her. Car accident. Her mother, too. I was driving." The confession slipped out, raw and heavy, and he braced for Ellie to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering over his before settling on the table. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "What do you want me to do?" "To pretend." Samuel looked up, startled by her willingness. "Just talk to me, like you would a father. Tell me about your day, your dreams. Anything." His voice trembled with hope, a fragile thing he hadn't felt in years. Ellie hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, Dad," she said, testing the word. It felt strange, but not wrong. "I had a rough morning. Spilled coffee on my shoes, and my boss gave me that look, you know? But I'm saving up for this art class I want to take. I love drawing, always have." She smiled, a little shy, and Samuel's eyes glistened. For the next hour, they talked. Ellie spoke of her sketches, her dream of opening a gallery, her fear of failing. Samuel listened, nodding, asking gentle questions, his heart swelling with a warmth he thought he'd lost forever. He told her about Clara's love for poetry, how she'd recite Frost under the stars. The cafe buzzed around them, but they were in their own world, a father and a daughter who weren't, yet somehow were. As Ellie stood to return to her shift, Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn buka collection of poems Clara had loved. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hands. "She'd want someone like you to have it." Ellie opened the cover, seeing Clara's name scrawled in childish handwriting. Her throat tightened. "I'll take care of it," she promised. As she walked away, Samuel watched her, feeling lighter than he had in decades. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. But as the cafe door chimed, a new figure stepped in. A man in his 50s, with graying hair and a sharp gaze. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Samuel. His expression wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something else, something that hinted at a past Samuel hadn't mentioned. The man approached, his steps deliberate. "Samuel Grayson?" he asked, voice low. Samuel froze, his heart stuttering. "Who's asking?" The man didn't smile. Someone who knew Clara. Samuel's hands tightened around his coffee mug, the warmth long gone. The stranger stood over him, his shadow cutting across the table like a blade. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said, his voice carrying a weight that made the cafe's chatter fade into a dull hum. Samuel squinted, searching the man's face lined, weathered, with eyes that held a flicker of something familiar yet distant. "Should I?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his chest. The man pulled out a chair and sat without asking, his movements precise, like someone used to being in control. "Name's Daniel," he said. "Daniel Harper. I was Clara's English teacher. The one who got her into poetry." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "The one you blamed after the accident." The words hit Samuel like a punch. Memories flooded back: Clara's funeral, the rage that had consumed him, the accusations he'd hurled at anyone close to her, including her favorite teacher. He'd screamed at Daniel, blaming him for filling Clara's head with dreams that kept her out late, for not being there to save her. It was irrational, born of grief, but Samuel hadn't cared then. Now, seeing Daniel's face, the guilt he'd buried clawed its way to the surface. "I was out of my mind," Samuel stammered. "I didn't mean." "You meant it," Daniel cut in, not cruelly but firmly. "You said I failed her. Maybe I did. But you weren't the only one who lost her, Samuel." His voice softened, revealing a crack of pain. "She was like a daughter to me, too." Samuel's throat burned. He hadn't known. Clara had talked about Mr. Harper endlessly, his lessons, his encouragement, how he'd lent her books when she couldn't afford them. But Samuel had been too wrapped in his own sorrow to see anyone else's. "Why are you here?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "I found this in my old files. Clara wrote it for a class assignment. It's about you." He slid the paper across the table. "I thought you should have it." Samuel's hands shook as he unfolded it. Clara's handwriting, looping and precise, stared back at him. The title read, "My Hero." The essay described a father who worked long hours at the factory to buy her books, who stayed up late to listen to her read, who taught her to find beauty in the ordinary. Tears blurred Samuel's vision. He hadn't known she saw him that way. "She loved you more than anything," Daniel said quietly. "I thought you should know that." Samuel couldn't speak. He clutched the paper, his chest aching with a mix of pride and regret. Before he could respond, Ellie returned, her apron smudged with coffee. She glanced between the two men, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. Daniel stood, offering her a small smile. "Just delivering something overdue." He nodded to Samuel. "Take care, Mr. Grayson." He walked out, leaving the essay and a heavy silence behind. Ellie slid into the chair Daniel had vacated. "Who was that?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the paper in Samuel's hands. "Someone who knew my daughter," Samuel said, his voice thick. He hesitated, then handed her the essay. "Read it, please." Ellie read silently, her expression softening with each line. When she finished, she looked at Samuel, her eyes shining. "She was proud of you," she said. "I can see why." For the rest of the morning, they talked again. Ellie shared more about her art, her fears of not being good enough, and Samuel found himself opening up about his life after Clara, how he'd quit the factory, how he'd wandered from city to city, trying to outrun his grief. Ellie listened, her presence a balm to wounds he thought would never heal. As the lunch rush began, Ellie had to return to work, but she promised to sit with him again tomorrow. Samuel watched her go, the essay still in his hands. For the first time, he felt a flicker of purpose, a reason to keep coming back to this cafe, to keep talking, to keep living. But as he left that afternoon, a woman watched him from across the street. She was older, her face lined with years, but her eyes held a spark of recognition. She clutched a photograph of a teenage girl, her fingers tracing the edges. She hadn't come for Samuel, not yet, but she knew who he was. The woman across the street lingered, her scarf fluttering in the autumn wind. She didn't follow Samuel as he shuffled down the sidewalk, the essay tucked inside his coat. But her eyes, sharp and searching, never left him until he turned the corner. Samuel didn't notice her. His mind was still in the cafe, replaying Ellie's laughter, the weight of Clara's words in her essay. He walked slowly, his cane tapping the pavement, each step feeling lighter than the last. For years, guilt had been his shadow, whispering that he'd failed Clara, that the accident was his fault. But her essay, her love scrawled in ink, had cracked something open inside him. He wasn't ready to forgive himself, but he was starting to believe he could try. The next morning, he returned to the cafe, the book of poems and Clara's essay in his pocket. Ellie greeted him with a smile, her apron already stained from the breakfast rush. "Morning, Dad," she said playfully, setting down his coffee. The word still felt strange, but it warmed Samuel's chest like sunlight. They fell into their routine, talking between her shifts. Ellie told him about her latest sketch, a portrait of her mother, who'd passed when she was a child. "I keep trying to get her eyes right," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "They were so kind, you know. I don't want to forget them." Samuel nodded, understanding too well. Clara's eyes were like that, always seeing the best in people. He paused, then added, "You're like her in that way." Ellie blushed, busying herself with wiping the table. "You're sweet," she said. "But I'm just me." "You're enough," Samuel said, his voice firm. "Don't ever think you're not." Their conversations grew deeper each day. Ellie shared her dreams of traveling, of seeing Paris and sketching its streets. Samuel told her about Clara's love for the stars, how they'd camp in the backyard with a telescope, naming constellations. The cafe became their sanctuary, a place where time softened the edges of their pain. But the woman from across the street returned. She sat at a corner table now, her coat buttoned to her chin, a cup of tea untouched before her. Her name was Margaret, and she'd known Clara, too, not as a teacher, but as a neighbor, a friend who'd watched her grow up. Margaret had been there the night of the accident, had heard the screech of tires, had run to the scene too late. She'd carried her own guilt, believing she could have stopped Clara from getting in the car if she'd just called out. Margaret watched Samuel and Ellie, her heart twisting. She'd come to the cafe after years of searching, tracking Samuel through old letters and rumors. She hadn't planned to confront him, but seeing him with Ellie smiling, alive in a way she hadn't expected, stirred something in her. She wanted answers, closure, maybe forgiveness. One morning, as Ellie cleared tables, Margaret approached Samuel. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I'm Margaret. I lived next door to you and Clara." Samuel's face paled. He remembered her now, the kind woman who'd baked Clara cookies, who'd sat with them on the porch during summer evenings. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely audible. Why are you here?" She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly. "I need to talk about Clara. About that night." Her voice broke. "I saw her before she left with you. She was so happy, talking about a poetry reading. I should have stopped her, told her to stay home." Samuel's breath caught. "It wasn't your fault," he said, the words heavy. "It was mine. I was driving. I didn't see the truck." Margaret shook her head, tears spilling. "We've both been carrying this for too long. I came to tell you Clara wouldn't want this. She'd want you to live, not just survive." The words pierced Samuel, echoing the essay he'd read. He looked at Margaret, seeing her pain mirror his own. "I'm trying," he whispered. "Ellie, she's helping." Margaret glanced at Ellie, who was watching from the counter, concern in her eyes. "She's special," Margaret said. "Like Clara was." That night, Samuel left the cafe with Margaret's words in his heart. He didn't know if he could let go of the guilt, but he wanted to try for Clara, for Ellie, for himself. The cafe's windows glowed against the evening chill, casting soft light on the street where Samuel stood, his scarf tight against the wind. He'd stayed later than usual, lingering over his coffee as Ellie sketched at his table, her pencil dancing across a napkin. Her drawing was of him, his weathered hands, his thoughtful Aisa portrait that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. "You're good at this," Samuel said, his voice warm. "Clara would have loved it. She always said art could say what words couldn't." Ellie smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm glad you think so, Dad." The word came easier now, a quiet bond between them. She didn't know if she was helping him heal or if he was helping her, but it felt right. Inside, the cafe was quiet, the last patrons gone. Margaret had returned, sitting at her usual corner table, watching them. She'd come every day since their talk, not always speaking, but listening, her presence a gentle reminder of the past they shared. Samuel had started to look forward to her quiet company, her stories of Clara filling gaps in his memories. Tonight, though, Margaret had a purpose. She approached their table, a small box in her hands. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "I've been holding on to this for years. It's time you had it." She opened the box, revealing a silver locket. Inside was a photo of Clara, her smile bright, her eyes full of life. Samuel's breath hitched. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his fingers trembling as he took it. "Clara gave it to me before that night," Margaret said. "She said it was for safekeeping. I think she knew you'd need it someday." Samuel held the locket, tears streaming down his face. He saw Clara in every detail, the curve of her smile, the spark in her eyes. He looked at Ellie, who was watching him with quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said to Margaret, then to Ellie. "Both of you." Ellie reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "She's still with you," she said. "And I'm here too." The next morning, Samuel arrived at the cafe with a new determination. He'd spent the night writing a letter to Clara, words he'd never said when she was alive. He gave it to Ellie, asking her to read it aloud, as Clara used to. Ellie's voice trembled as she read his apologies, his love, his promise to live for her. When she finished, the cafe was silent, but the air felt lighter, as if Clara's spirit had heard. Margaret joined them, sharing her own memories, and the three of them talked until the sun rose higher. They spoke of forgiveness, of moving forward, of finding joy in small things. Samuel realized he wasn't just pretending anymore. Ellie had become a daughter in her own right, and Margaret a friend who understood his pain. As weeks passed, the cafe became a place of healing. Samuel started writing poetry again, inspired by Clara's book. Ellie hung her sketches on the walls, her art brightening the space. Margaret brought old photos, piecing together a mosaic of Clara's life. Together, they built something Newa family not bound by blood, but by shared loss and love. One evening, as Samuel left the cafe, he looked back at Ellie and Margaret laughing inside. He clutched the locket, feeling Clara's presence, not as a weight, but as a light guiding him forward. He wasn't whole yet, but he was closer than he'd ever been.